Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be covering a case where a note that was left behind by a young girl seems to be the only clue towards her whereabouts. But as her mother quickly learned, the words written may have been a lie. This investigation has taken numerous twists and turns with very few answers. But one thing continues to be true. A killer has remained free for far too long. Today's case is about the murder of Kathy Beatty. Kathy Beatty was responsible. Her mother always wanted her home before dark, and she consistently abided by that rule. However, on the night of July 24th, 1975, after Kathy's mother Patricia got home late, like past 11 p.m. late, she found that her daughter wasn't home, which was completely unlike her. That night was a bit different than most, though. A friend of Kathy's mom had been a part of a lottery drawing that day where, I guess, she could potentially win $1 million. Patricia was obviously excited for her friend, so she went with her to this drawing that was taking place in Baltimore, Maryland, which was approximately 35 miles or roughly like a 40 to 45 minute drive from Aspen Hill, Maryland, where the Beatty family lived. Pat had actually invited Kathy, who was 15 at the time, as well as her sister Teresa, who was 17, to join her and this friend, but the girls declined the invitation. Then that afternoon, around 4 p.m., before Patricia was set to leave to make her trip to Baltimore, it's reported that Kathy had asked her mother if she could go out and ride her bike. And it was July, so the sun wouldn't be setting for a while, so Pat said, sure thing, go ahead and have fun. Kathy left her home on Frankfort Drive sometime between 4 and 4:30 that afternoon, and obviously planned to be home before dark, considering her mom's rule. And just knowing that it's summertime, you're probably thinking the sun isn't going to be setting until sometime around 8 or 8:30, and Patricia had planned to be home by 9, so bearing that in mind, she expected Kathy to be home when she got back from Baltimore. Patricia told the Washington Post, quote, "I said I would be home at 9. She knew she had to be home by 8:30 because she wasn't allowed out after dark. We said goodbye and she went off on her bike," end quote. At some point that night, though, bad weather hit the Maryland area. There was thunder, lightning, torrential downpours, and by the time Patricia fought her way through the rough weather to her home in Aspen Hill, she hadn't arrived back until almost 11 o'clock, 2 hours after her originally planned time. And as I mentioned before, she assumed she would see Kathy at home, but when she pulled in the driveway and saw that there were no lights on in the house, she was immediately worried. Once Pat made her way inside and turned on the lights, she found a note from Kathy, which stated she was going to be spending some time that night over at her friend Sue's house and that she'd be back by 10 p.m. And before we move any further in the story, I just want to mention how much this is already throwing me off and makes me question Kathy's real plans, because she knew she needed to be home by sundown, and 10 p.m. is far later than she ever should have been out. Like her mom had mentioned in that quote I read before, she was pretty strict on when her daughter needed to be home, so why is she going to risk getting into trouble?
She was strict on her daughter being home, but she wasn't going to be home till 9 o'clock anyway either.
But then why would she say, oh, I'm going to stay out till 10? Like, if you were going to try and finagle your way into staying out later, be like, oh, I'll just stay out until 9 instead. Like, if mom's going to be home.
Well, it's one of those things where it's beg for forgiveness instead of asking for permission.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So if she's going to leave, her mom already left. She's like, oh, I want to go and hang out with my friend tonight. So I'm just going to leave a note because I'm already planning on staying out later. Mm-hmm. And if mom's not going to be home, she can't tell me no.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to leave this letter. That way she's not worried about me. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to go do my thing with my friend.
I mean, maybe, but also just like kind of knowing everything Pat has ever said about her daughter and things like that. Like, she seemed like she was a very responsible young girl and, you know, that she wasn't going to go off and do that, but you never know.
So mom gets home, sees this note. I assume her next step is to contact Sue's parents.
Yeah. So the other thing, though, before we move on to that, is something else that came into my mind while I was researching this had to do with her leaving. Now there's this horrible weather. Remember, she left on her bike.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So then how's she going to get home if she claims, like, I'm going to be home at 10 p.m.? Now it's 11. Is she still waiting at Sue's maybe? because now it's bad weather and she's waiting for mom to find her and say, Mom, come get me. Like, I'm sorry, whatever. Right.
Wait for the weather to break.
Yeah.
As opposed to trying to make it home through the shitty weather.
Exactly.
At least mom knows where I am.
Yep.
She can come get me in the car.
Yeah. So she probably left the note to just be, like you said, I'm safe. Here I am. And now she's like, shit, I screwed up. Maybe like that's what mom's thinking. And instant panic isn't totally setting it at this point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, mom was already delayed herself. So now she thinks, oh, well.
If I was delayed, she's probably delayed.
Either that or she's probably pissed. She's like, oh, she's going to get it.
Yep, exactly.
But it does make me wonder, like, where's the other sibling and where's the dad at this point?
Well, the sister had a boyfriend, and I don't know if the dad, like, worked a different shift. Like, I don't know any of that. All I know is that this particular night, nobody else was home. Kathy went out and did her thing. Mom did her thing. Teresa was probably with her boyfriend,
And Teresa was how old?
17.
Oh, okay. That makes sense then.
Yeah. So, anyway, Pat decided that she was going to go check things out for herself. The note said that Kathy would be at Sue's, so to Sue's she went. But of course, once she arrived there, Kathy was nowhere to be found. And from what I understand and from my interpretation of what's been reported, Sue and whoever was at the house with her had told Pat that Kathy had been there earlier that night, but she'd already left by the time Pat had gotten there to check on her.
Do we know what time she left?
No, that hasn't been stated.
Because if she was like in the note, if Kathy was saying that she was going to be home by 10,
yep.
She could have left at 9:45 if it was nearby.
Yep.
And then maybe something happened along the way.
Maybe. I think based on what we've talked about already, it's clear that this wasn't something that Kathy would do often. It was stated that she was dependable and she knew her mother wanted her home, so she'd be home, like you were just saying. But Patricia just wasn't feeling overly comfortable with the whole situation, and she wasn't just going to go to bed and wait for her daughter to show up. So at some point, Patricia does go home and she uses the phone to call several of Kathy's other friends to see if any of them knew where she might be. None of them had any information for her regarding Kathy's whereabouts. Along with these calls to Kathy's friends, though, Patricia would also make another, potentially more important phone call to somebody else that might have knowledge of where her daughter might be. It became apparent in my research that Kathy had some sort of love interest at the time. It seemed as though the two were either dating, had previously dated, or at the very least, he might have just been someone Kathy had a crush on. If I'm being honest, the reporting on this has differed a bit regarding the relationship itself, but the Washington Post did describe the two as being, quote, sweethearts in 8th grade, which was just the year prior to when our story takes place. But regardless of the formality of the relationship between the two, something was going on between them, and Patricia seemed to know about it. So she figured she'd call this boy to see if he might be privy to information that she wasn't regarding where Kathy might be. It's reported that when Patricia calls this boy's house, she ends up getting in touch with his father, and from what I can tell, neither of these individuals have ever been publicly named. So moving forward, we'll just call the boy the love interest, and dad can be the dad of the love interest. So when Pat called and spoke with the dad of the love interest, he told her that his son was apparently outside sleeping in some camper with one of his friends, and he mentioned that he would go check on them and see if they knew anything about Kathy's whereabouts. However, apparently when he goes to do that, he discovered that his son and his son's friend were nowhere to be found.
He met up with Kathy somewhere.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So,
first off, I was like, was the friend supposed to be Joe Schmo? But was it Kathy? Like staying in the camper.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
But
maybe.
then when they're not there, he was probably like, oh, I'll stay out in the camper. Dad would have no other reason to go check on him.
Yeah.
If that wasn't like how he was.
Yeah.
Like a hoverer or whatever.
Yeah.
Until Kathy's mom shows up.
Yeah.
So he could have been out doing whatever.
Totally possible.
Dad would have never known anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kathy's mom didn't show up. She called.
Called. Until if Kathy's mom called. Yeah.
I can't quite tell if Patricia was still on the phone with the love interest dad at the time or if he called her back to let her know he didn't know where his son and his friend were, but from what I understand, the dad was supposed to be calling Pat back once he heard from his kid. So that's just something to put out there so you know. And knowing teenage boys, this whole scenario really doesn't surprise me at all. And it's starting to make things make a little bit more sense regarding where Kathy was. I mean, she did have a crush on this boy at the very least, and maybe she risked her mother's displeasure with her being late to go out past her curfew to meet up with this boy. And as we're working through this, I'm already starting to get the idea in my head that Kathy may have had Sue, the friend that was mentioned in the note, cover for her, and then she'd go see this guy.
I'm kind of piecing it together in my head there. where, yeah, I'm going to go hang out with Sue, but this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to say that I'm hanging out with Sue. I'm going to go stay with Sue for a little while so they can say, yes, I was there, but then my real thing is to go meet up with the love interest.
Exactly.
So maybe she left Sue's at 9.
Maybe.
Who knows what time, if it wasn't reported. Met up with this kid, whatever. It makes me think of the Ashley Willette story a little bit. I'm going to hang out with my friends.
Yeah.
And ends up at this party.
Yep.
And
ends
then
up
from
at
the party,
Sanborn's house.
ends up
and
at the
then
Sanborn's house, and then from there.
Yeah.
It's always like
15-year-olds, man.
Honestly, I'm not looking forward to them.
No.
But it's one of those things where now you're starting to piece it together where Kathy wasn't the type of girl to do this. Her mom was like, oh, it's not like her. Then for this letter to be left there, the letter says that she's going to stay out later than she was supposed to.
But it's just with Sue.
But it's
not
just
with
Sue. Right, it's with Sue, so don't worry about it.
But
it turns out that there may have been plans to meet up with this other kid, and who knows, at this point, it's not substantiated that's where she went.
Exactly.
At this point, we could totally believe that she stayed at Sue's until 9:30.
And then tried to get home, and for some reason something happened.
Right.
Exactly. So at this point, Patricia hasn't really gotten any further in her search for her daughter outside of finding out where she wasn't. So she gets in her car and drove around some local areas to see if she could find Kathy. And I do just want to mention that I had seen it reported in a handful of articles on this case that at some point in time during this whole situation, Patricia was more worried about the scenario than Kathy's sister Teresa was. The two were close in age. I can only imagine that Teresa had probably done something similar to this and didn't really think there was anything too much to worry about, at least not yet.
Right, and Teresa was probably with her boyfriend from what you said, because she wasn't home.
Yep.
And she was probably like, oh, she's hanging out with so-and-so, the love interest. It's like, no, she's probably with him, like, don't worry about it, type thing, brushing it off, because she probably knew the dynamic between her and this other kid.
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, I understand that.
As I mentioned earlier on, the Beatty family lived in a town known as Aspen Hill, and it seems to be a relatively nice area with a fairly large population, currently about 53,000 based on niche.com. Pat would go on to search near Parkland Junior High School, which was located only about a mile and a half east of the Beatty's home, and from what I can tell, Kathy either previously attended that school or she hung out there regularly since it was so close by. She had just turned 15, so she'd just started high school and probably went to the junior high previously. And just thinking back and trying to make connections, maybe this is where she knew this love interest from back in 8th grade, like the Washington Post mentioned.
Well, I mean, thinking back to, like, high school, middle school relationships and stuff, if you live close enough by, go to, like, a playground, sit on swings.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff like that.
Yep. So just knowing that, it seems like this would have been a good place for Patricia to look for her, but unfortunately, she was unable to find any sign of her daughter there. It's reported that she also went and searched near the local Kmart, which was located on Connecticut Ave in Silver Spring, Maryland. The location of the Kmart is about a mile in the other direction of the Beatty's home, so to the west. And just for reference, so you can get a good idea of the proximity of these locations, there's a really great video on WMAR2 Maryland Mysteries, which includes an aerial map of the distance between Parkland Junior High, Kathy's home, and the Kmart location where Pat had looked for her daughter. I'll have a screenshot of the map on our socials if you want to take a look. Basically, the junior high is farthest east, Kathy's home being in the middle, and then the Kmart is furthest west on the map. Now, behind the Kmart was a spot known as The Hill, and then directly next to that was another spot known as The Rocks, which were literally a hill and then a bunch of rocks.
What's crazy is, like, hearing you tell this story and now doing this format and knowing nothing about it, when you give landmarks or you're talking about, a particular aspect of the story, my mind automatically goes to, like, a certain place. And this makes me think of Henry Bedard Jr.
I literally have it written in here. This makes me think of Henry Bedard Jr.
Yes.
It's literally the whatever it was called, like looking over the DPW parking lot. Like my mind went immediately there when I heard of these two. Like
a hangout for the kids around that age.
But they have very original names for these places.
the Hills and the Rock. Yeah.
So I sent you the pictures of the overhead map that I was just explaining, and then like what the hill and the rocks looks like, so that you can kind of get like a little bit of a visual in your head. Anybody listening can go look on social media. I'll have them there, but so you have them readily available here, John, I've sent them to you.
Okay, I'm looking at them.
All right. So the thing that I find weird, though, and everywhere that I've seen it reported, is that the Kmart was like a mile in the opposite direction. Does that not look like that Kmart's like 3 miles in the other direction? Like, it's so much further, but like all the written stuff on this case has been like, oh, it's 1 mile in this direction or 1 mile in that direction. That looks really far.
Yeah, it does look pretty far, but like, I guess if you were to zoom in and block it out, like if you're looking at Kathy's house and then the number of houses and stuff like that from there, it's probably a mile, but like you have to traverse all these roads and stuff. So
I think the junior high is probably like a quarter of a mile. Like, that's really close.
Yeah. I'm thinking that the middle school is like super close.
Definitely.
It's like
you could
blocks.
walk there easily, but like if you're going to go to Kmart, you're going to drive.
Yeah, well, not in 75. In 75, everybody walked everywhere.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if this were today's time,
yeah,
you would drive.
These look like kind of like main roads, I guess.
Yeah. And then just seeing like what the rocks look like, all of that. So that's what it looked like back in 75. Today, that's no longer there. That's just a bunch of townhouses over it. So this is like what it looked like in 75.
So this is just the rocks. This is not the hill.
The hill like comes down, like in front of it almost.
So the rocks are at the crest of the hill?
Kind of, yeah. I think there's like more behind it too. So it's like
you.
it goes like further back.
So you have to go up the hill to get to the rocks.
Yes, exactly. So it seems as though these two places were frequented a lot by local kids, and I can assume Kathy as well. And it was actually also reported that Kathy would go by this Kmart location on occasion, as she had this interest in mini bikes, and I guess she would like kind of window shop there. So I think that's kind of another reason why that prompted her mom to go there, because she knew she liked it there.
Yeah, I suppose, but I think by 11 o'clock, I don't think Kmart's open in 1975 anymore.
Well, I mean, the mini bikes would still be in the window, wouldn't they? If she's looking at them?
I guess, but if it's torrential downpours, do you think she's going to be standing out there? I really want that mini bike with fucking thunder and lightning around.
The weather just went completely out of my brain. Like, I'm thinking it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and sunny, and she's like, yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Of course, I totally don't fault her mother for that. I would do the same thing. You would think of any possible place that your child had gone to on a regular basis or would be drawn to. That's where you're going, and even places that don't make sense. Not that the Kmart doesn't, but like, you're grasping at straws now. You're looking everywhere.
Yeah. So as Patricia searched around this area, from what I can tell, it seems like it was like a cursory glance over, not really like a foot search. I mean, you have to think, going back to it being 11 o'clock, probably past midnight at this point, she probably didn't want to be looking in this secluded area in the dark.
At the same time, if you're out looking for your child, you have like no compass to point you in the right direction. So you're trying to look across the largest number of areas as you can, so you can't take all that time.
And I bet you're probably thinking, like, you're just going to see her walking. Right. Yeah, it's like you don't need to search, like, in bushes and all this stuff. You're like, I'm going to see my kid walking along the street, and I'm going to grab her, and I'm going to be like, what the heck is wrong with you? I'm going to bring her home. Like, that's probably where your mind is.
Right.
But conveniently, while Patricia's there, she runs into a police officer. And there's a passage regarding this exchange Patricia had with this officer in the Washington Post. It stated, quote, I told him what the problem was and asked him if he would go up to Kmart. I had been up there, but it had been so dark. The police officer told her to go home and wait for an hour. If she did not hear from him, it would mean that he hadn't found Kathy and she should file a missing persons report. End quote.
I think that's fair.
I agree. Patricia went on to explain that she did follow this officer's instructions and waited to hear back from him, but when she never received a call, she did what he'd mentioned and reported her daughter missing. It's also mentioned that Patricia had called the love interest's house again that next morning to see if he was finally home, to double check to see if he knew anything about Kathy's whereabouts. But when she spoke to the young man during the early morning hours of July 25th, he was supposedly unable to provide Patricia with any information, and he said he didn't know where Kathy was and he hadn't spoken with her either.
Sus.
Yes, it is. Now, at this point, I think is when Kathy's sister Teresa started to become more concerned about her. And she and her boyfriend decided that they would assist in her mom's efforts to try and find her. From what I can piece together, I think they started this search of their own after Patricia had already reported Kathy missing. They, too, went to check the hill and the rocks, most likely because they knew it was a popular hangout spot and probably figured if Kathy were anywhere, she'd be there.
It's strange that they would think that she'd still be there.
I mean, you're just going to search anywhere, and it's like kids always hung out here, so let me look here. Like maybe she stayed out all night with a boy or she did something. You don't know.
The weather is what still catches me and makes me think otherwise. At this point, the next day, and the cop had looked at Kmart, couldn't come up with anything. You talked to Sue. She wasn't there. I'm thinking without your mind going to worst case scenario, she's got to be at somebody's house.
Yeah.
She couldn't have stayed out all night through torrential downpours for no reason.
Well, maybe in the back of their head, they did have worst case scenario.
I get that. If they're going back to search at the rock in the hill, I can get that. But if they're still hopeful and they're like, she's got to be somewhere. Like, there's no way this happened.
Yeah.
There's no way that she's dead.
Yeah.
She's got to be at somebody's house.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying. So I think you can look at it in both ways.
I think, yeah, like you said, if now her sister's finally worried the next day.
Yeah.
You're right. Maybe they are thinking,
like, oh shit, maybe she went here with a friend last night and something bad happened. We need to check.
Right.
Yeah. Well, as Teresa and her boyfriend searched this area, they stumbled upon Kathy's purse. So now they're most likely thinking she's got to be here, so let's keep looking. From what I can tell, I think Teresa made her way over towards the rocks by herself based on what's been reported. And this is where Teresa finds Kathy. She was unconscious, but she was still alive. Teresa screamed for her boyfriend, and they called 911 to have paramedics come to try and save Kathy's life. It's reported that Teresa's boyfriend also called Patricia to let her know they'd found Kathy, but he didn't disclose anything regarding what had happened to her.
Wow. Obviously, hindsight's 20/20, Monday morning quarterbacking and stuff, but you got to think that when Patricia talked to this cop, she's like, oh, Kmart, it was so dark. She probably mentioned the hill and
the rocks. Yep.
And cops of the time had a much more, I guess, community understanding of what was going on with the kids at that time. It's like, whatever these cops were doing before they became police officers, these kids are probably doing then. So he probably knew about that. I wonder if he just never went and looked back there. He only like checked the perimeter of Kmart, like the parking lot and stuff like that, and never went back there. And
well,
that
I
could
mean,
be
if you did like a spotlight on the hill, but if she was up at the rocks, like you're kind of up over the hill at that point. So maybe if he did check with like the spotlight on his car or whatever, he might have just missed her.
Yeah.
And the thing that sucks about that too is like, for all we know, like she's there all night long.
Well, that's what I'm saying. All that time lost.
But alive.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. All that time lost. Like if she had been found 8 hours earlier, she could have been in much better shape.
Exactly. It's horrifying.
Especially if, like, not to get like even more morbid about it and stuff, but if Patricia went and looked over there, she's like looking for her daughter. It's too dark. She can't see anything. Like, knowing that she looked over there and her daughter was laying there dying there.
Yep.
And it's like wicked fucked up.
And it's fucked up too that Teresa finds her. Like, that's just horrible to have to find that. Like, as much as it's you want to find her, like it would ease the burden, I think, mentally, like if the officer had found her.
Right.
To not have to see that.
Right. That's an image that you're going to live with forever.
Exactly.
I think it's, for lack of a better term, it's not like a bright side, but like to find her alive. At least there's hope in that.
Yes. So once medics arrived on scene, they transported Kathy to the hospital where she laid in a coma. The severity of Kathy's injuries were horrific, as it's been reported that she'd been hit in the head with a blunt object and had what's been described as a, quote, depressed fracture of the skull, end quote.
I don't know how severe that is. I'll pull it up. This type of fracture may be seen with or without a cut in the scalp. In this fracture, part of the skull is actually sunken in from the trauma. This type of skull fracture may require surgical intervention depending on the severity to help correct the deformity.
Essentially, her head was bashed in and crushed.
Right. It was almost caved in.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was also reported that her pants were off when she was found and that she had been sexually assaulted but not raped. And there was something of note when police were speaking publicly about the sexual assault. When interviewed, they've said that they would not provide any further details on the sexual assault aspect to this case. My guess is there's something very important there that could be a key clue in who did this to Kathy.
So there was never any type of penetration or anything done.
Correct.
I'm wondering why they don't want to provide more information. Unless it's like you said, there's some type of evidence there that could tie to whoever did this.
So I wonder if you're kind of thinking along the same lines I am. When I was researching this and I found this out, the first thing that came to mind was the love interest. They're both, I assume, if they were in 8th grade, they're both 15. So, they're probably not sexually active yet. What if things were happening, maybe experimenting, and even if it wasn't with this particular person, what if it was anybody in general? And then she didn't want to continue. And then things got a little more forceful. And then that's where it comes into it was sexual assault, not rape, because that didn't fully happen.
Right.
But then maybe the sexual assault started to take place and she was upset and she said that she's going to tell somebody or whatever. And then they either hit her or did whatever.
Yeah.
And then that's where, obviously this crime occurred.
I would say that we're on the same wavelength with that.
Okay.
Also, I'm wondering, they say that she was, beaten with a blunt object. Could that blunt object been her falling on a rock? Could somebody have pushed her or struck her with something like that?
It's so interesting you say that.
Where somebody doesn't necessarily have a weapon to beat her with, but they're on the hill, they're at the rocks. Could have pushed her, could have picked up a rock, could have hit her with a rock, something like that. I'm wondering if this was like an accidental death, or like you said, maybe they were progressing, they were kissing, making out, whatever, and then as things progressed, she didn't want to do anything anymore, and this person who subsequently killed her maybe pushed her, and she fell back and hit her head on a rock.
We don't know exactly where the depression in her skull was. Was it on the top of her head, the front of her head, the back of her head? I think those could be indicators, but I just feel like that takes like a lot of force. I don't know, knowing where on her head this depression is, I think would send me in one way or another on what I believe, but it's very much like you that you're already thinking this way, as we're going to dive a little bit more into her injuries later.
Sure. And when you think of it requires a lot of force to do that type of damage to somebody, you want to think of your body like a pendulum, right? The further your body has to fall from the top, your head down to the ground, the more force it's going to hit. So if you're standing straight up and you fall straight over onto a rock, that's a lot of...
But unless you're unconscious, I mean...
Do you think you would be if you fucking crushed your head on it?
No, before you fall. The thought is, and like the natural human reaction is to cover your head or try and catch yourself.
So I know that boys and girls are probably more of the same size, roughly, maybe.
Around 15 years old.
Around 15 years old.
Yeah.
But if I two-handed pushed you in your chest, you would fly back and crush your skull on a rock.
I guess, yeah. Okay, I can see it.
You would be trying to stop yourself, but you would be grasping out forwards.
That's true.
You'd be like, oh my God. And you would just have no time to react to it. So
again, I think it just goes right back to where is the depression? Because if you're falling face first, you're going to put your hands out in front of you.
Right.
But if you're falling backwards, I think that's a different story.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So at this point, we know that Kathy is still alive, but she's in a coma. During this time in the hospital, the Beatty family prayed that Kathy would regain consciousness. And not only did the family, of course, hope for this, but so did authorities. Obviously, they wanted her to live, but they were probably also thinking in terms of their investigation, with hopes that if she might be able to talk again, that she would be able to tell them who'd done this to her. Major Wayne Brown told the Washington Post, quote, "The hospital personnel led us to believe that she would be able to talk. That's what we needed, a little break," end quote. However, after 11 days of being in a coma and fighting for her life, Kathy Beatty would succumb to her injuries and passed away on August 5th, 1975. Her cause of death had been described as complications from the injuries sustained during the assault, as well as blood poisoning, otherwise known as sepsis.
I wonder if her dying of sepsis is indicative of a time frame for how long she was out there injured.
Ooh, that's a good point. I didn't think of that.
Because if she had been out there since 7 o'clock, and, for 12 hours she was out there in the rain and everything, in the dirt.
We don't even know when the family found her either. There's no definitive timeline. Like, we know the mom had reported her missing sometime, probably in the middle of the night. Then she called the boy at 7 o'clock in the morning, but we don't know when Teresa and her boyfriend went out. Yeah. So it could have even been longer than that. Yeah,
so I'm just wondering if the sepsis was due to her being out with that open wound for so long.
Definite possibility. So now, at this point, the case had changed from an assault to a murder investigation. Authorities quickly got to work to try and find Kathy's killer. Based on reporting done on the case, it appears as though investigators were able to get some statements from witnesses that had seen Kathy in the area that night, which seemed like a good start. The first sighting of Kathy had been from a young boy who lived in her neighborhood. He stated that he'd seen Kathy at home sometime around 6:30 or 7 o'clock that evening. We know she'd left to ride her bike around 4 or 4:30, but then her note said she wouldn't be home until around 10. The next reported sighting is one near Parkland Junior High School, which, if you remember, was the first location that Patricia had gone to search the night that Kathy didn't come home. Witnesses stated, and it's unclear exactly how many witnesses there were, but they said they'd seen Kathy walking from the junior high towards her home on Frankfort Drive, which was only about a 10-minute walk. She was seen making this walk towards home around 8:30 p.m. that night, which was when Kathy should have been home based on her mother's rule about her being home before dark.
Walking, no bike.
That's what the witness statement said, but for all we know, maybe she was walking her bike.
True.
So now knowing about these two sightings, it makes me wonder, did Kathy go home around 6:30 or 7 when that boy had seen her, and that's when she left the note for her mother stating she was going to be at Sue's and would be home around 10? Had she gotten together with some friends, maybe had seen Sue there, and then asked her to cover for her? We obviously know the note wasn't there before Patricia had left the house.
Didn't Patricia talk to the mom? Sue's mom?
No, she talked to Sue.
Oh, okay.
From all accounts that I can tell, she talked to Sue.
Later on down the line, does anything come out that she was actually never at Sue's?
That's literally my next sentence. Yeah, it was found that Kathy was never at Sue's that night. And that's what made me think that this is just a cover to say, I'm going to go out with whoever. I'm going to write in this note to my mom that I'm going to go to your house. And if she asks you, just say I was there and then I left or something.
Right.
Yeah. So
okay. Now it makes sense.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Also, another thing that I think could be important, and I think police probably know more about, has to do with something I read in a Washington Post article that mentioned that this neighborhood boy that had seen Kathy actually spoke with her when she was home around 6:30 or 7. Now, I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere if she was with anyone at this time or if she told this boy what she was up to or anything like that. But I mention this because I was thinking maybe whether it be a friend, whether it be this love interest, you don't know, but maybe they went together to Kathy's house or like he met up there with her and she wrote the note and then they went on their merry way together after. And then say this witness said, oh, I saw Kathy with so-and-so, blah, 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 but police don't want to release that information to the public because maybe this person isn't a person of interest or a suspect or anything yet, and you don't want to taint somebody's name by putting it out there.
Right.
But that kind of helps lead into trying to nail down the timeline of things, and that's most likely what authorities were attempting to do at the time as well. So let's just do a quick recap. Kathy leaves home at 4 p.m. on her bike. She's seen again at home between 6:30 and 7. Then she's seen walking from Parkland Junior High towards home at 8:30. So then, where did she go from there? From what I understand, Kathy was alone at this 8:30 p.m. sighting when she was walking from the junior high. So then the question is, how could she have gotten from this location to behind the Kmart? And as we know from looking at that map, it seems further away. Authorities have stated that they're unsure when or how she got to this location. And her family has said that they are certain she never would have gone there alone. And just knowing the kind of kid that Kathy was, I can totally get behind that statement. If she knew she needed to be home before dark, she always abided by that rule. Why would she have ever gone somewhere by herself? I think she would maybe break that rule with or for someone else.
So I know the love interest has never been named publicly, but where does he live?
I don't know anything about him.
So they don't live past Kmart?
Don't know.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, there's really not much else out there regarding the timeline of events and why or how she got to the Kmart.
At least with the timeline, we know that she was alive at 8:30. And if you're thinking she's near her house at 8:30, it's about a mile to the Kmart. The rocks are a little bit past that. Probably looking at a half-hour walk.
Yep.
So
you're looking at, if anything were to have happened, probably around 9 or 9:30.
9 or later.
Yeah,
right.
I agree. Now, as we move forward, I do want to go over a few things that were found at the scene that may assist investigators in nailing down who Kathy's killer was. First of all, I had mentioned previously that Kathy's pants had been taken off and that she'd been sexually assaulted. But not only were her pants removed, but so were her shoes. And her shoes have never been found. Several publications had mentioned that there was a lot of glass and rocks and debris in that area, so it's been questioned why she would have been barefoot, and I have the same question. But to further that, what I'm more curious about would be the state of her feet. Did she try and run away from her attacker after having taken her shoes off already? Or did the person or persons that assaulted her take them from the scene after this crime was committed to try and hide evidence?
Were they a specific type of shoe?
Unclear.
I'm wondering, would someone steal the shoes?
Well, then I was also thinking, too, like, could it be flip-flops? It's summer.
True.
Like, could they have just been, she left them somewhere and someone snagged them? Like, you don't know. Something like that. But I think it's like, why would you also be barefoot in an area like that? Like, it's called the rocks. They're rocks. Like, it's going to hurt your feet.
Right. There's rocks, and like you said, there's glass and debris and stuff. People are probably up there drinking, whatever, throwing bottles.
Yep, exactly. So I think it's sus that they're not there.
Yes, I agree.
Not only do authorities have the whole removed jeans situation and the missing shoes to question, but they also found a physical object at the scene that, at least to me, seems to be something that might be pretty easily identifiable. And that is a set of car keys. Now, I have a photo here of what these keys looked like. John, I'll send it to you so you can take a look. And to all our listeners, if you want to take a look at them, there will be a photo of the keys on our socials. So, for starters, I will say authorities have confirmed that these keys did not belong to Kathy.
Strange. So, a couple thoughts to me. Neither of these look like a house key.
Okay.
At least a current day house key to me. And then you have this little, looks like a black or dark leather tag with some type of maybe flowery
kind of looks like
imprint.
A leaf to me.
Yeah, leaf or flowers or something imprinted on it. Outside of that, I find it odd. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure not everybody has a ton of keys, but I'm thinking like my own personal keys, I have a lot more than just 2 on here.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is this like a work key that's only to a vehicle?
Maybe. Or is it like a spare set of keys, like you just keep your car key and your house key on it, or, you know.
But even to me, I don't think neither of those look like a house key.
See, I disagree. I think the one on the left looks like a house key.
I guess. Maybe I've always had like similar heads to the keys.
Well, like don't think about the head of the key. Look at the base of the key. Like you can see, at least on the one that you would think is more of a car key, it seems flat on one side to me.
Yeah.
Like, was that like an old car thing? And then this one looks more like you have the grooves on both sides. Like that key reminds me of like what our house key looks like.
I guess, yeah, it could be. And if you think about it, I mean, back in the day, what are people going to have a key to? Just their house and one lock on their door. And
exactly. So it's probably a lot different back then.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that authorities have brought these keys to a locksmith to see if they could find any additional info on them and try to match them to a specific car.
What popped into my head was the lockpicking lawyer from YouTube.
Yeah,
I was like, I bet he could look at these keys and be like,
this was belonging to this and this was belonging to that. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So authorities have determined that one of the keys on the keychain was a car key that belonged to a General Motors car.
Okay.
Now, I know that Web Sleuths is not the most reliable source in the world, but I will say there has been so much discussion and speculation and all of that regarding these keys on forums about Kathy's case. And there's this one particular user who goes by Richard that has done like this crazy in-depth research into like the kind of doorknob that this potential house key could fit into, what kind of cars this potential car key could fit into. And what he has to say is like incredibly interesting. So I wanted to read it to you. So first of all, he mentions he's pretty positive that this key was used for outside doorknobs, meaning the one that looks like a house key. So it was likely someone's keychain with their car key and their house key on it, but nothing else. Now, what he mentions about the car key was far more interesting. So I'm going to read what he said. He stated, quote, "The GM vehicle key is for an ignition cylinder. I believe that GM began using that style of key with the rectangle end sometime in the late 1960s. Before it, they made a key with an octagon-shaped end. The police state that it was for a 1972 model. They may know this because each year, GM changed the long groove location along the side of the key. This meant that you could not put a 1972 key into a 1973 model lock. By 1972, all GM automobiles, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, required 2 keys. The rectangle one, shown on the website, was for the ignition. Oval-shaped ones were for the doors and trunks. A possible exception, however, may have been the Chevy or GMC pickup truck and possibly the Chevy or GMC van. I have not nailed it down for certain at this point. I know that in 1970, the ignition key also unlocked the doors on the pickup truck and larger trucks. By 1973, pickups had 2 keys, like the cars, one for ignition and another for doors, end quote.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. I was like, Richard, you know what you're talking about. I'm like, this guy has done his research. So I really wanted to at least bring that up because we don't know who's listening and what they might also know.
One thing, and when you're trying to narrow down the key, what type of key, like I was saying with the lockpick or whatever.
Yeah.
But one thing I didn't even think about that I remember my parents' cars had was a different key to unlock the doors.
Yeah.
And a different key to start the car.
I didn't think that either. So it's like, okay, so maybe one of these isn't a house key. Who knows? But like, what if it's literally just like your spare set of keys for that car and you have your ignition key and then you have your door and your trunk keys. So maybe that's what this is.
Yep.
Something else that people were talking about too was like, could this be like a kid's key to their first car or something? Like, you know, they just have like their one thing on it. Like they don't need all this other stuff.
One thing that still sticks out to me is you made mention that, you know, for the one exception could have been a particular type of pickup truck. So could that have been a key to a business and then a key to a work truck?
Yeah. Or the other thought was, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but could it be a key to a camper?
Could be, I guess, yeah.
So something along those lines. So outside of the witness statements and these items found at the scene, it doesn't appear as though there was much for investigators to go on, and Kathy's case would soon go cold. The family was discouraged, to say the least, with Patricia later telling the Washington Post, quote, "The police seemed so sure in the beginning that they would find the person responsible, but now I am not so sure," end quote. With this stall in the investigation, it kind of leads me into theories and even a couple different cases that have actually been compared to Kathy's. We'll start with the first one that was likely on authorities' radar right from the get-go, as it happened less than 4 miles from where Kathy was killed and took place just 3 months prior. Now, this particular case I'm going to tell you about has been pretty highly publicized, and it's one that I feel like most true crime enthusiasts probably know already, but I can almost guarantee John hasn't heard of it before. So let's see if you think there's any sort of connection between the two and if speculation that the perpetrator may be the same is warranted here. In April of that same year, 1975, 2 young girls, Sheila and Catherine Lyons, who were just 11 and 13 years old at the time, went missing from a local mall that was just under 4 miles away from where Kathy was assaulted behind the Kmart. On March 25th, 1975, the 2 girls went to the Wheaton Mall and were seen with a suspicious man, and a description and sketch of that individual was produced and distributed out to the public. It's been reported that a local kid had seen the 2 girls conversing with a man who had a tape recorder with him, and I believe this child's sighting of the girls with this guy is how this sketch was provided and created.
It's always kids seeing people.
Honestly, it really is. Kids are observant, man.
Sharon Thor, you have the kid playing in the front yard.
Yep.
Crazy.
It's wild. Now, not only did this child come forward with the description, but so did another person. This individual came forward about a week after the incident and spoke with the security guard at the mall regarding what he'd seen that day. He claimed he saw a man talking to the sisters holding a tape recorder, which, mind you, that information had already been reported in local papers, so it's not like it wasn't public information already. This new witness also mentioned that he'd seen this man force the 2 girls into a car. Authorities felt strongly enough about his story that they brought the guy in, gave him a polygraph test, which he failed, mind you, and then sent him on his merry way. Based on original police reports, it appears as though authorities believed he was a, quote, unreliable witness and never spoke with him again.
Well, unreliable witness is one thing, but
failing a polygraph might be another.
He might be a suspect.
Honestly.
Is this the guy that gave the description?
Yes. That came forward a week later to give a similar or same description that this young kid had given. But again, that had already been put out to the public. So is he just doing it for kicks and giggles, or, you know?
He's just coming in to try and get, you know, recognition for it. Be like, oh my God, I saw them too.
Yeah.
Just reiterating the stuff that the kid already put out.
Yep, exactly. So after exhaustive searches of the area, countless interviews conducted, and a ton of dead-end leads, investigators were unable to close the case or find the girls' remains, and it sat unsolved for decades. That is, until 2012, when authorities re-reviewed the old case files and found something intriguing. That individual that had come forward to the security guard a week after the girls went missing piqued their interest. That man's name was Lloyd Lee Welch, and back in 1975, He was 18 years old and already had a pretty hefty history of past charges and convictions. Sometime around 1998, he'd actually been imprisoned for the sexual assault of a 10-year-old girl in Delaware. And once police tracked him down all those years later, he was still in prison. After years of countless interviews and incriminating statements, authorities were finally able to discover a hole big enough in his story to pick at until he confessed. During one of the interrogations of Welch, he stated that the sisters were, quote, abducted, raped, and burned up, end quote. At some point, authorities were also able to get more information out of him and obtained a description of the house that these crimes supposedly all went down in. It took Welch years to finally give any sort of confession, but he also would never take the blame fully on himself, as he mentioned that his uncle and father were the ones mainly involved and that they forced him to clean up after them.
Mm-hmm.
It's unclear how true any of that is, but based on what's been reported, authorities were able to find evidence to corroborate Welch's story. Now, according to an article with the New Zealand Herald, Welch stated, quote, I plead guilty to felony first-degree murder, end quote. This same article continues on to state, quote, Welch did not admit to directly killing either girl, but he was held accountable for their deaths in the commission of abduction with intent to defile, end quote. Now, this is as basic a rundown I can give you on this case without spending another hour on this one alone, because as I mentioned, it's a very widely known case and there are a lot of twists and turns. But just based on this basic knowledge that I've laid out, I know what my opinions are on this case and if there's a possible connection, if any, to Kathy's. But John, I want to hear your thoughts first.
I don't think so.
Okay, good. We're on the same page. There's, other than the extremely wild coincidence of the proximity and the time frame,
mm-hmm.
What else is there to go on?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think these girls were abducted. They were younger. He somehow coerced them to get into the car,
mm-hmm.
to get away and stuff. Like, I assume it was probably a fair day.
Yeah, I mean, it was April or March.
Right, so I'm sure it wasn't torrential downpour thunderstorm
mm-hmm.
where he's out trying to abduct people at a rock.
Yeah.
Behind a Kmart.
Yeah.
Like, he's probably out prowling, in public areas.
And they've never been found either. That's a huge difference. Like, Kathy was just left out there rather than supposedly burning these girls' bodies to
mm-hmm.
never find them again. So I can understand, in one respect, why armchair detectives and probably the detectives working this case were like, is there a connection here? We really do need to look into this because that is a weird coincidence that it could happen so close in time, so close in location. That's just wild to hear about, like in the news, like 2 girls go missing, they're never found, and then 4 months later, another girl's murdered. You're gonna try and put together a connection there.
Especially when you have nothing to go on.
Exactly. The case is cold. Like, you have to look at other options.
So my thing is with Lloyd Lee Welch,
mm-hmm.
were his dad and uncle really bad guys? Did they look into them?
Yeah, good question. Definitely a good question.
But outside of that, I don't feel there's any connection here. There's nothing, even while I was looking at tooled key fob leather chains to look for something similar to the keys that were found at the rocks, nothing you said made me snap to and be like, oh, there's a link.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think everybody can tell that we don't think there is a strong connection here. But there is actually another individual who many believed could have been involved in Kathy's murder. While I have my own beliefs on who I think is involved, I don't think this next scenario is one to be completely discounted. So let's dive into it. The next person of interest we're going to discuss is a man by the name of Fred Coffey. He's been convicted of murder previously and is suspected in multiple other felonies, including other murders. The guy is a bad dude. But how does that tie him to Kathy? We need to talk about the murder Mr. Coffey was convicted of before we can attempt to try and connect him to Kathy's murder. So, 4 years after Kathy was killed, on July 18th, 1979, a 10-year-old girl by the name of Amanda Ray left her home at the Woodbury Hills Apartments in North Carolina to go fishing at a pond known as Briar Creek with a man she'd met the day before. It's reported that she'd been seen that same afternoon with this man by local kids. The next day, Amanda's body would be found near what's been described as a, quote, private pond over 15 miles away from the Woodbury Hills Apartments where Amanda had lived. Now, I know what you're already thinking. North Carolina and Maryland? What the hell is the connection here? I mean, honestly, at this point in my research, when this was all I knew, I was in the same boat as you. but don't discount the whole thing just yet. It was determined that Amanda was strangled to death, but they were unable to catch her killer for years. Then, on February 18th, 1981, a 5-year-old girl named Neely Smith was murdered, and her remains were found near a creek 2 months later on April 11th. It was not conclusive because her remains were, from what I can tell, partially skeletal, but it was believed that she too had been strangled. Finally, in 1987, after years of investigating Amanda's murder case, authorities arrested Fred Coffey and took him to trial to convict him for the murder of Amanda Ray. The case seemed to be so airtight that it took the jury less than an hour to come to their guilty verdict. Fred Coffey would be sentenced to death, but ultimately that sentence would be vacated and he was resentenced to life, but he has the possibility of parole. However, Amanda's family would never let that happen. Every 3 years when Coffey comes up for parole, they push to get everyone they possibly can to write letters to the parole board to ensure he never gets out. And it seems to be working pretty well because this dude has been denied parole up to 15 times and he's still locked up to this day.
I find it strange that they would go for the death penalty against this guy and then vacate the sentence and drop it to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Why even put parole on the table?
Don't know.
It's okay, sure, he's off death row, but don't give him a parole opportunity.
Well, there are a lot of wild things that happen in the judicial system, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, over the years, Fred Coffey has had various charges and convictions against him. He pled guilty to molesting 2 young girls in North Carolina, which he received 50 years in prison for. But not only that, we know he was convicted in Amanda's case. He's been suspected in the murder of Neely Smith, also suspected in another death of a 12-year-old girl in North Carolina, and the murder of a young boy named Travis King. And that's not even counting all the crap I'm sure this dude did that he's never been linked to.
I guess to go back to my whole thing about, how is he getting the possibility of parole?
Yeah.
He's not getting out anyway. He's got 50 years hanging from this one, life in prison, possibility of parole with this one. Obviously, every time he goes in front of the parole board, you would think that they're going to be like, no, you're not getting out, even without all these letters being written to him.
But you want to make sure.
Yeah.
Do not let this freaking guy get out.
Yeah, every time I think of the parole board, I always think of Shawshank Redemption. I don't know if you've ever seen it. But
No, I have not.
I always think of, like, Red. He was in there since he was, like, a teen. And every time they go in front of the parole board, essentially they're looking to see if these people have changed, for lack of a better term, to see if they show remorse or they're sorry or they're a different person now because they've spent their entire life in there.
Yeah.
And if there's one indiscretion that sent this person to prison, okay, maybe they changed. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was whatever.
Yeah.
But when you have all these things being tied to this guy, I don't think he's ever getting out. But think about how many people get out of prison on a light sentence, and then they go and they do the same. They commit the exact same crime.
Yep. Yeah. Awful.
Right.
Anyway, going back to Amanda and Neely's cases, the biggest connections between those two seems to be the fact that Coffey lived nearby to both girls, was seen in the area when they were killed, and he had a history as a child molester. The girls were both very young, just 5 and 10, and their cause of death was the same. In my opinion, those two cases certainly seem similar, and if Fred Coffey killed Amanda Ray, he most likely probably also killed Neely Smith. But where is the connection here to Kathy? None of this really seems to match up. 2 different states, different causes of death, ages are way off. There's definitely a difference between a teenager and a young girl who likely hasn't gone through puberty yet. So then how has any sort of connection ever been made between Kathy's case and Fred Coffey?
No connection there for me.
Yeah.
I could rule out.
Waiting patiently.
Yeah, I mean, there's still, obviously, the guy's a bad guy.
Yeah.
But I still don't see a connection.
Okay, well, get this. Back in 1975, specifically from April 24th to July 31st of 75, Fred Coffey worked at a place known as Vitro Laboratories. And Vitro Laboratories was located directly across the street from the Kmart Kathy was found behind.
Okay, we're getting there.
Now, at first glance, this might just seem like it's just another strange coincidence like we talked about with Sheila and Catherine Lyons, which, I mean, I don't fault anybody for thinking that because it is a weird coincidence. But not only did Coffey work right across the street from where Kathy was assaulted, but I kid you not, literally 1 week after Kathy was attacked, on July 31st, so remember, Kathy was attacked on the 24th, so that's 1 week later, Fred just up and quit his job abruptly and moved out of the area. The The Washington Post reported that Coffey, quote, told his employers that his wife and daughter had been injured in a Kentucky car accident, end quote.
He had a wife and daughter?
Honestly, I don't even know. But mind you, he'd apparently used this same excuse previously. And then detectives that were working on Amanda's case later came to realize that this was totally fabricated because he's used this ruse numerous times before.
I wonder if that's like his out after he commits some type of crime. He's like, oh, this tragedy happened. It worked before, so I'm just going to use it again.
Yeah, exactly. So like, yes, that's a weird coincidence that he worked there, but then also thinking like he literally quit a week later after working for this job for less than 3 months. That's weird.
That's weird. I wonder what kind of car he drove.
See, I was wondering the same thing. So I haven't seen that like reported by large publications, but I'll tell you, man, there is a lot of speculation on like Reddit and Web Sleuths and all these other forums talking about like, did they compare these keys to Fred Coffey's cars, like things like that. I do know he had a van at one point. I don't think there was any exact connection, but people were thinking that maybe because they had talked about like this GMC van and like these other options, could it have belonged to him? So there's definitely been like a lot of talk about it, but nothing like concretely said like this guy had this car and it matches this key and whatever. So
this whole portion of Coffey's story, I can start seeing a connection here.
Yeah.
But what still gets me are the ages, cause of death. She was sexually assaulted but not raped. There's still a lot missing there, but this guy was there at the time. Who knows? Maybe he found out that this girl was like in a coma or was going to die, and he thought he might be linked to it because of his past or whatever.
Yeah.
So I wonder if he had already been on police's radar at this time, and he was like, I need to get out of here before I get jammed up on this. And maybe that's why he just left his job abruptly. Yeah. I was like, I got to get out of here.
Because then they'll look at me.
Because they'll look at me and they're going to jam me up and I'm going to get put in prison for this, and I didn't do it.
Well, here's something. Interestingly enough, Fred Coffey had also been a person of interest in the Lyons sisters case.
Interesting.
So if he was a person of interest there, maybe he was like, shit.
Ah, yes. Maybe he felt the heat was coming down on him because he was a person of interest in that. Then this happened, and he's like, they're going to pull me in as a person of interest for this.
Yeah, very possible.
That's interesting. Yes, very strange, but he was a person of interest on the Lyons, but wasn't the guy. He could be a person of interest in this and still not the guy. I think his victims were younger, like you said, probably prepubescent.
Yeah.
Strangled them.
Yep. Those two things are just so different to me. That's like the main thing. That,
and
like,
distinct.
Yes, very distinct.
To strangle somebody to death versus beat them to death, totally different.
And I just feel like, of course, and this just goes back to what we were just saying about Lloyd Lee Welch, you have to look at it as an option because the coincidences are uncanny. It's like, really, this guy literally worked across the street? Like, what if he worked late that night? Or you don't know. And
it just seems like a really bad fucking place to live at this time of the...
Honestly. And
right?
I think
it's like...
the media was going crazy. People were reeling. Like, this was like a wild, wild time.
Right.
And maybe that goes back to what you were saying about Coffey wanting to leave the area because he's like, shit is nuts right now. And if they are looking at me in this case, they're going to look at me in this other one.
In my opinion, I don't think he was involved in either of them.
Yeah, see, I don't either. But the weird thing is he apparently also used a similar ruse to the one with the tape recorder that was used to abduct Sheila and Catherine. And he used like other means to lure kids to him, like how he was able to get Amanda to go fishing with him and things like that. So he kind of used those tactics to get kids to come with him. But that, again, just goes back to how does that fit in Kathy's case? It just doesn't to me.
It doesn't. And I don't think those type of tactics really work as well on teenagers.
I agree. Yeah. And
a kid, you're like we always think about child abductors. Oh, you want some candy? Come over here. Get this. It's like little treats, or you build a relationship with someone, things like that.
Yeah.
Amy Mahalovic.
Yes, exactly.
We're going to go get your mom a present.
Yep.
Like things like that. Those work on young kids, you know, early teens.
Yeah.
But once you hit that middle school, high school age,
you're starting to like, understand the way of the world here. And it doesn't exactly work the same. Something else that I found interesting, too, that there was a little bit of talk about was regarding Lloyd Lee Welch and Coffey and a potential connection between the two of them.
I was honestly going to say something about that. I was like, what are these guys doing? Like having meetings, like ways to lure children, to abduct children and stuff. Oh, I use a tape recorder. No, I use a fishing pole. And we do this. It's like fucking online forums for incels and shit. It's fucking weird.
Yeah. So the thing is, we know that Lloyd implicated others in the Lyon sisters' crime. He said it was his father and his uncle and all these other people that weren't him. And it took a lot of conversations with police for them to pull any sort of confession out of him. So then what if Lloyd and Fred had this weird connection and maybe he was trying to like cover for Fred and said, oh, it was my dad and my uncle or whatever. Like, but what if Fred was involved in some way? Like people have gone back and forth on that. Like, I don't know exactly where I sit with it because I haven't done enough research into either of them. Mainly, I wanted to focus on this case, but if I did a deep dive into Lloyd Lee Welch and Fred Coffey, like I'm sure I could probably find some sort of connection there. But at this point, like I feel like maybe not, maybe it's grasping at straws a little bit, but something that you can't discount.
Yeah, it goes without saying that it is weird that two guys that have similar MOs that like to attack younger individuals using similar tactics are both in the same area at the same time.
It's weird.
Weird coincidence. Does it mean that they're connected? No, but like you said, it should be noted.
Okay, so now that we've gotten way off track in discussing these two cases that have in some ways been linked to Kathy's, let's get back to her case. We were discussing theories and the idea that one of these two suspects may have been involved. We obviously have come to a pretty concrete conclusion that these two other cases are not connected to Kathy's. But there is one additional theory to work off of that I want to go over, but we need to cover a few things in terms of the current investigation before we can dive into that. So in 2012, a local private investigator took on Kathy's case and began working alongside authorities on it. Stephen Kerpelman was a police officer with Prince George's County PD before he started his PI firm known as SMK Investigations. He actually knew Kathy back in the 70s and has taken on her case at no cost to the family. He told local DVM, quote, "Kathy went to school with me. We've been in class together the year before she was found, and for years, people, my friends who I went to school with, always wondered what happened to Kathy. We're still looking for who did it," end quote. Another passage in that same article from Kerpelman stated, quote, "I want what Kathy's mother wants. She wants to know the truth of what happened to her daughter. At this point, that doesn't necessarily mean prosecution. She just wants to know. Her mother is getting up there in age, and her wish is, before she dies, I hate to say it, but she wants to know what happened to Kathy," end quote. Steve Kerpelman has also been working closely with Frank Colbert, who's a detective for Montgomery County PD's Cold Case Division, and he too knew Kathy when they were growing up. Regarding where they are with the case and some of the difficulties that come along with trying to solve it all these years later, Colbert told WUSA 9, quote, "A lot of rumors, a lot of things out there that may be true, may not be true, but get perpetuated," end quote. Basically, it seems as though authorities have a couple things in mind regarding what could have happened to Kathy, but more than anything, and what is the final theory in this case, is that Kathy may have known her assailant and that whatever happened that night wasn't pre-planned. There have been a few scenarios thrown around. One of the current detectives on the case had told the Washington Post, quote, "It's highly possible that she ran from her assailant and fell against a blunt object. I've always felt the result wasn't intended, and that would be mitigating if a person came forward to ease his or her conscience," end quote. Authorities have also made mention a rock may have been the type of object used to kill her, whether on the ground or in someone's hand, and have stated that it was, quote, "something of an irregular shape," end quote.
I told you.
I know. I mean, I get what you're saying on it. And I think, again, I'm just going to go back to what I said before. If we knew where the depression in her skull was, I think that would help me to decide which way I lean.
Sure. I think if in that quote they're saying maybe she was running from her assailant, you'd probably assume that it's on the front of her.
That's what I thought too, yeah. But like that much force, if you fall forward, like I would just think that you would try and catch yourself.
I mean, yes, but you would think, is it possible though? It's fucking downpouring, it's thundering, it's lightning.
I guess,
You're running, you slip. Like, think of how fast things happen.
Yeah.
So when you think also the depressed fracture of the skull, right? Where that's something that could have like a laceration before it damages the skull and indents the skull.
Yep.
If you think like a baseball bat, a blunt object, something like that, it's more of a flat surface where, like if you think of a hammer versus a baseball bat, hammer, smaller, round object, more likely to create a divot into something. Like you take a baseball bat, you hit the ground, may not really see where you hit the ground. You take a hammer, you hit the ground, you're going to see the divot.
Yeah.
So when you think of a rock, somebody hits their head on a rock, it's probably sharp. There's a lot of different levels to it. A lot easier to almost cause like a penetrating wound and crush your skull that way because the point of impact is so much smaller and the force could still be great if you're falling and getting hit by the rock or if somebody's hitting you with the rock. That's why I thought, depressed skull, unless she's struck multiple times with an object or something like that, she's at a place called the Rocks. Could have been an accidental death or could have been running away.
Yeah. So over the years, authorities as well as Steve Kerpelman have conducted hundreds of interviews and have even gone on to state things like, quote, they have ideas about who was involved, end quote. Authorities have also stated that there have been suspects, whether that's now or in the past, who knows, but it appears as though there was never enough evidence to indict anybody. And mind you, any of these suspects that they've stated they had have never been named publicly. The number one thing that seems to be clear, though, to both authorities, Kerpelman, and honestly myself, is that whoever did this likely knew Kathy. And it's even been mentioned that it's possible whoever did this is still local to the area.
I would have to assume that they both plan to meet up at this area.
It just all makes sense with the timeline, like using Sue as a cover, and the fact that, like, she had this love interest, like before I even knew that she had been potentially dating somebody or anything, that was immediately where my mind went. I was like, is this a boyfriend? Did she go to meet with a boyfriend? They got into some sort of sexual interaction. She was not comfortable with it and things just went bad.
Right.
And that's, I think, regardless of all these other cases and trying to connect everything and this, that, and the other thing, what I initially thought is where I land now.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I'm along that same line too. And now knowing that Patricia didn't talk to Sue's parents, she talked to Sue, and Sue lied to cover for her friend, that makes it even more suspicious that, she's going out to meet a boy.
Yes.
It would go over a lot better with Mom to say, oh, I went to Sue's.
Yes. Then I went to so-and-so's and we hung out in the woods. Like that right there is, kid, what are you doing?
Right.
Yeah, I get that.
I find it interesting that nothing more has come out, as even like releasing this love interest name.
Yeah.
I really want to know who this is, what type of connections they have in town, shit like that. Is there a reason that it's not released?
I think it goes back to like what we were talking about earlier with Henry Bedard. And I think this case like really reminded me of that one, not only with like the whole location thing, but like the blunt object being used and thinking that it's someone that was local that has never been released or talked about. And it's like, why? Literally, Henry Bedard happened in 74. This happened in 75. Like, it has been how many years? Is that individual still alive? Do they have powerful connections in town? Is there something else going on there that you don't want to ruffle the wrong feathers until you are 100% certain this is your person?
Right.
And that's what I feel like is going on here and why nobody's releasing any names. Because if they've had suspects, if they have ideas about who did this, if they think they know what happened, but they can't fully piece it together perfectly, that's exactly where my mind goes, is that this is someone that they could get in a lot of hot water with if they say something.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that all they have to work with now, because you think it happened at night, she was there for maybe upwards of 10 hours overnight through the rain and everything. They have very little physical evidence. Besides those keys, what else are you going to gather from that scene?
Yeah.
DNA wasn't a thing at that time. They're not going to gather all that stuff. She wasn't raped, so they didn't gather anything from that, really. There has to be a link to somebody that she knew. I find it odd that that love interest wasn't made public, and you tell this story, or everybody that listens to this story that's been in a position where, I'm going to, tell my parents I'm going one place and I'm going to go somewhere else. You think, okay, yeah, I'm going to go where my parents maybe wouldn't approve of me going to, but if I tell them I'm going to see a friend, they wouldn't think so much of it. It just makes sense that it had to be a love interest.
Yeah.
Maybe not this one in particular. Yeah. Maybe somebody else.
Could it have been someone else? Exactly. Maybe that's why they're not releasing the name. Maybe like she had a new crush at school because she just started high school. Maybe it was somebody else and they don't want to implicate this other person. just in case there's a risk there that it wasn't him. But it is just strange, like just knowing like he's not in the camper.
Right.
Come on.
Right.
He's not in the camper like he's supposed to be in the camper.
With a friend.
But exactly. So where's the friend too?
Right. And who was the friend supposed to be?
Yeah. Is the friend holding this secret now all these years later?
Right.
Is the friend going to
Was that friend the love interest, Sue?
Exactly.
Saying, oh yeah, no, I was in the camper with him.
Well, I don't know. Like maybe the dad had seen this friend with him too, though. Like he said he was supposed to be with a friend, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's just like all of these little things. It's like, sure, you can talk about Fred Coffey and say, well, that's a really freaking weird coincidence that he worked across the street and then like he ends up quitting his job a week later. Like that's real weird. But all these things with the love interest and the friends and covering for her and the camper and the keys and all of this, like that is way sketchier to me than anything with these other two guys.
I've got to think, and just from if I were conducting this investigation, the first thing that I would do once I have this physical evidence, the physical evidence being the keys, and I realize that there's really nothing else I have to go on, I'd be going to people's houses. I'd say, hey, can I try this key on your door? Hey, can I try this key in your car? And be marking down everybody that it works on as far as maybe the
model
car,
or
the car, because if it works on all GM cars for this year or whatever. But, and I'm wondering, like, how many people can this 15-year-old know?
Yeah. Probably
I don't know.
not that
There's
many.
shadiness. I feel like, I don't want to say shadiness. I feel like I'm really hung up on why not more was put out about this love interest.
I am hung up on that as well. And I thought that, like, as I dug deeper into this case and I found out more and more, it's like, you know, obviously I wanted to bring in these other cases that have been compared to it and all of that. But at the end of the day, like, I feel like this would have been a more to go over and talk about and go into if we knew more about that person, because that just seemed so much more likely to me. That's where my head went from the very beginning. I've said it before, I'm saying it again. Like, it's
even before all these other people, you know, Welch and Coffee and all them, like, yeah, they're bad guys, but this doesn't look like it was a murder on purpose. It was an accident, probably. This girl went up to this weird hangout place. She had to go there with somebody she knew because she was almost home at 8:30. She was probably home before 9 o'clock.
She was probably getting home when she fucking told her mom she was going to get home.
Right.
Like,
and then somehow she ends up over there.
Yeah. And was like, oh, well, maybe I'll go hang out with so-and-so. Like, this will be fun or whatever. And then something else that just like randomly popped into my head that I wanted to mention, but something about the keys that I was thinking about, and I was going back to what Richard had said on Web Sleuths, was he was mentioning something about it being a 1972 model. It was 1975. That's a relatively new car for the time. So were these people rich?
I'm thinking these people had a camper.
These people probably had money.
Right. Like if it was a camper in the backyard, it's not like they lived in the camper.
Yes. It's not like a mobile home.
Right. They had to be upper middle class probably.
It seemed like a nice area based on niche.com.
Right. So, I mean, when you look at the picture that you sent me of the town, it looks like a nice town. It doesn't look like run down or anything. It looks like your typical suburbia.
Yeah, exactly.
So for them, for that to be a potentially 1972 model vehicle, for this love interest to have, or his parents to have this camper in the backyard, must have had money. Like you said, if you start linking all those things together, I find it very odd that not more was put out there. When, in respect to this, what has been released about them? Oh, they were looked into and they're not a person of interest?
Nothing.
Nothing has been put out.
Nothing.
That's fucking bizarre. And very suspect.
A lot of it seems to be like very vague. They'll say those things like, we have ideas about who it could have been. We had suspects, but not enough to indict anyone. Like all these things, it's like, is it this person that you're talking about? Like, is it this one guy? And
then put yourself in Teresa's shoes.
Yeah.
Like, she probably knows this kid. She probably knows all this stuff that's going on. I mean, I wonder what the dynamic was in that town around that time with Teresa probably having a general idea of who this kid was and who her sister was hanging around with. I mean, if they're only 2 years difference in age, I understand that Teresa was probably really into her boyfriend at the time. She was out with him that night and shit like that. But she must have known about her life.
Yeah.
And who she hung out with, who she talked to and shit. So, I don't know. It's very, very frustrating. Even if he's not involved, it's frustrating to not be able to rule him out because, you know me, until I have a reason to rule somebody out, I'm not going to do it. And you know so little.
Exactly.
So not only do you want to rule them out, you want more information to rule them out, but there's a lot of stuff around that points at them.
Yes. And I think it goes back to the sexual assault not being a rape. They're young. How many kids are experimenting at that time, trying to do whatever they're going to do? And then it's like, you might just say like, no, I don't want to do that. And you're a 15-year-old girl. You don't understand any of this stuff. And it was different back in 75. You're probably not talking to your mom about all these things when it comes to sex. And
right. Well, you think of like, this is the era where like people would like go and park.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And be like, oh, the makeout spot.
Yeah.
And stuff. So yeah, sex may have not been a dynamic that she was ready for.
Yeah.
And that was my whole thinking in immediately going to an accident or hitting her head on a rock or something like that, where, you know, maybe somebody didn't kill her. Their action killed her, but they did not murder her. And that's why I was thinking the rock and, you know, pushing her down or something like that. And then the person panicking.
Then why take
away.
her shoes? What if they did take her shoes and it's, you know, it's not just like they got lost or something. Like, what if they physically took them?
Yeah.
Did she try and hit them? Did she kick them or like something? I don't know. Like, what are you thinking in that moment to take something like that?
Yeah, because in this realm of true crime, you think, oh, was it taken as a trophy? Was this a planned attack?
But
type
that
thing?
no,
but
not
it
in
doesn't.
any way. Like if it were Fred Coffey or Lloyd Lee Welch, maybe they'd be like, I'm going to take this necklace because that to them is like to bring them back to the crime they committed. This person, I don't think ever wants to go back to this. I think they want to forget this ever happened. And same thing, like if this friend was there too with this person, if this is what happened, not saying that it was, totally speculating here, but what if it was this guy and his friend? Maybe there was even another girl there with this other friend. Like, what if these people all saw that this happened and then it's like, shit, what do we do? And now multiple people are holding on to this. Honestly, just say something.
Right.
It's going to make you feel better.
Right.
Conscience will be clear.
It's odd that we've, you know, our episode last week, and I think a lot of these cases that have gone on for so long, all the parents and people involved, family members, whatever, that have lost someone are thinking the same way. I want to know what happened.
It's the not knowing.
I want to ease my conscience and know what happened. I've gone 50 years with this person not being prosecuted. That is like back burner to me. I just want to know.
Just freaking tell me. Just man up. This is what happened. We are so sorry that this is what happened. If you are at the point now where like this PI is saying you're beyond prosecution, what are you waiting for?
Right.
This is so cruel to do to loved ones like this.
Well, that's because people always look out for themselves, and they think, you know, even if this person now, right, say they were 15 in 74, we're talking almost 50 years ago, they're probably before 70, they're younger than 70 years old. You know, they still have years to go, and now they don't want to put it out to their family and be like, oh yeah, I killed this girl all that time ago. So people always think about themselves, whereas they don't think about the family that has been suffering through this for decades now. Yes, it would be great for the Beatty family to know what happened. Somebody still has to put their family through knowing that they killed a girl or were involved in killing a girl. So they're thinking about themselves as opposed to providing the Beatty family with the kindness of saying, this is what happened.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Now, something else Kerpelman said in an article with local DVM really resonated with me. He stated, quote, "If it happened today, it would probably be a million videos of what happened. Kathy would have had a smartphone today. The businesses had videos, and the Kmart has one on the front of the store," end quote. It's so true, and like you were saying before, with these older cases, it's so difficult, and authorities are at such a disadvantage decades later. Sure, we're seeing so many cases being solved with genetic genealogy and DNA testing and all this stuff, but that's not every case, and without things like video proof or cell phone records or additional evidence that you can look into, if there's nothing physical that you can use for DNA or for any type of testing, you're kind of just left with the hope that someone will come forward.
Right. If you have nothing physical, all you have are eyewitness testimonies, a confession, or finding the person that's involved and wearing them down like Welch.
Yeah, exactly.
Just wear them down over time until you get the true story out of it.
Yeah. And I'll just continue to preach this. It's one of the main reasons why we do this podcast. Without people spreading the word, without getting it out there, how will anyone know if what they know might be something of importance? In this particular case, authorities have mentioned that they need someone to come forward. But I have also seen it reported that DNA evidence was being resubmitted and retested back in 2019. I have no idea where this supposed DNA evidence has come from, whether that be from the sexual assault Kathy endured, or maybe her pants or the keys left at the scene. and it's unfortunately unclear if anything has come of this testing yet, but at least there's still some hope there. Kathy's mother yearned for answers before she died, but unfortunately, she passed away in November of 2020. I do find comfort in the fact that Patricia is now with her daughter and likely has all the answers she was ever looking for. But before she passed, Patricia had been so heartbroken by her daughter's murder that she just couldn't bear to change her bedroom, even 40 years later. On a GoFundMe page that Patricia created for reward money in Kathy's case, she stated, quote, "Her canopy bed remains in her bedroom filled with stuffed animals. Kathy loved all God's creatures. She was kind to her schoolmates and stood up for those that were bullied or shunned. Kids can be cruel, but Kathy was born with a kind heart and a gentle soul," end quote. The GoFundMe page appears to still be up and running as of May 2022, and any funds that aren't able to be used as a reward for an arrest or conviction in Kathy's case are going to be donated to St. Jude's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. I'll have a link to the GoFundMe page in the show notes. Something else that Kerpelman had said in an article with the Sentinel really rings true. He stated, quote, "People will sometimes call in and say, 'Well, I don't know if this matters, but I remember that this guy used to hang out up there.' They don't realize how grateful we are for any lead that we can follow up on. Even if the person they point us to turns out to not know anything, maybe he knows someone who does. We still want people to call with whatever information they have." So, if you know anything about who killed Kathy Beatty, no matter how small you think it may be, please contact the Montgomery County Police Cold Case Unit at 240-773-5070 or SMK Investigations at 240-304-8633. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.